They say history is written by the victors, but what if the truth was buried with the fallen? Every secret leaves a trace, if you know where to look. This is The Broken Truth, decoding history, one broadcast at a time. The Broken Truth podcast, where history meets conspiracy. Every case tells a story, every story hides a lie. You are listening to a long-form investigative episode on Jeffrey Epstein and Zorro Ranch in New Mexico. Before we get started, I want to thank my Patreon exclusive member for requesting this episode. It's definitely something that I've been a little reluctant to cover, but the research is finally done, and this is going to be a very long, extremely jam-packed, full of information episode that's going to expose everything that's available on the public record. Over the course of this episode, we're going to do something that so far no government agency has done in public. Assemble a single, coherent, evidence-based record of what is known about this property, who went there, what survivors say happened there, how the system responded, and what was never done. I'll flag the nature of each claim as we go. When something is established in official records or widely corroborated reporting, I'll call it fact. When it comes from sworn court documents, indictments, complaints, depositions, I'll call it a court-documented claim. When an account comes directly from survivors or eyewitnesses, I'll identify it as survivor testimony. Unresolved or contested claims will be framed as allegations, and where the record runs out, I'll label that clearly as an unknown, not fill it with any speculation. This is going to be part one for this episode. Later installments will carry us all the way through survivor testimony, staff and logistics, political shielding, media silence, institutional inaction, and final fact allegation to the unknown matrix. The unsearched crime scene. Picture the high desert southeast of Santa Fe, New Mexico. You leave the city on US 285, trading galleries and tourists for piñon and open land. The air gets thinner, the houses stop. Then, miles from the nearest town, you see it, a vast elevated compound on a mesa, a mansion the size of a small hotel, with its own airstrip etched into the desert floor. This is Zorro Ranch. So here's a fact. Jeffrey Epstein bought this property in 1993 from former New Mexico Governor Bruce King and his family. The private holdings and associated parcels together total on the order of 7,000 to 10,000 acres. The centerpiece is roughly 26,700 square feet, with a massive great room, interior courtyard, and guest suites. The compound also includes a private airstrip and hangar, a helipad, a firehouse, garages, stables, and a village of outbuildings near the entrance. From the sky, it looks less like a family ranch and more like a self-contained campus. Another fact. Around the private land, Jeffrey Epstein's Virgin Islands company Cypress Incorporated leased an additional ring of more than 1,200 acres of New Mexico state trust land. On paper, these were agricultural grazing leases. In practice, state officials would later describe them as a privacy buffer, a publicly owned moat that helped keep outsiders away from Epstein's most remote American property. For years, Zorro Ranch was a curiosity, an odd, oversized compound owned by a secretive financier. When Epstein's 2008 Florida plea deal became public, reporters took note that he owned a place in New Mexico, but the spotlight stayed on Palm Beach. That changed in 2019. When federal agents arrested Jeffrey Epstein in New York in July of that year, they moved quickly. They raided his Manhattan townhouse. They raided his private island in the U.S. Virgin Islands. They cataloged safes, hard drives, and photographs. But one property never saw that treatment. Fact, there is no public record of the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, or any other federal agency ever executing a search warrant at Zorro Ranch. No images of evidence teams, no court-filed warrant returns, no press conferences describing what was found. New Mexico officials confirmed the same from their side. The state attorney general's office opened an investigation, interviewed women who said they were abused at the ranch, collected documents, and then closed its criminal probe without filing charges or executing a public search of the property. The ranch was never treated, at least in public view, as a crime scene. And yet, Survivor testimony places abuse at this ranch as early as 1996 and as late as the mid-2000s. A federal jury in New York heard detailed testimony about sexualized grooming and contact involving a 16-year-old girl at this property, and convicted Ghislaine Maxwell in part on a pattern of conduct that included New Mexico. Flight logs show dozens of arrivals into Santa Fe involving Epstein, Maxwell, and core staff over more than a decade. So there's a gap. A physical location we can map to the acre, a paper trail we can trace through corporate filings and land leases, and survivor accounts that surface in sworn testimony, without the kind of law enforcement response that would normally follow. This episode is an attempt to reconstruct, as far as the public records allow, the crime scene that was never searched. In part 1, we've set the scene, a real place owned by Epstein, connected to multiple properties by private jet, left largely untouched by federal agents. In part 2, we'll walk the deed records and the land office files. In part 3, we'll follow the paper from the New Mexico State Land Office to the Attorney General and back, and look at where state and federal authorities stopped, or chose to stop. Property and infrastructure record. If you want to understand Zorro Ranch as a possible crime scene, you have to start with what it was on paper. A bundle of parcels, corporate entities, and improvements that together made up a highly unusual ranch. The purchase, acreage, and geography. Let's begin in 1993. Fact: in that year, Jeffrey Epstein purchased what would become Zorro Ranch from former New Mexico Governor Bruce King and his family. Public reporting and later property descriptions put this purchase price in the neighborhood of $12 million. The property sits in southern Santa Fe County, near the tiny community of Stanley. It's roughly 30 to 35 miles southeast of Santa Fe, reachable by a combination of state and county roads. From the nearest paved highway, a long private road runs into the hills and up onto a mesa, terminating at the main compound. The numbers you see for size vary slightly across source, but they follow a consistent pattern. Roughly 7,500 acres of private land associated with the ranch itself, a total of around 10,000 acres if you include the surrounding state trust land parcels that Epstein's company leased. From the standpoint of isolation, the exact number is less important than the feel. This is a property you don't stumble across. You go there because you're invited, and you're taken well off public roads to get there. The mansion and built environment. At the top of that mesa sits the house. Fact: plans filed in the mid-1990s and later real estate listings. When the estate tried to sell the property in 2021, they described a 26,700 square foot main residence. Contemporary articles noted, with some astonishment, that the great room alone was on the order of 2,000 square feet, roughly the size of an average American home. The mansion is 3 stories tall and built around a central courtyard. It has multiple guest suites, an indoor pool, large entertaining and dining areas, service spaces for kitchen staff. Around it are the support structures, airstrips and hangars, a private runway long enough to handle Epstein's jets, with a hangar and a helipad. A firehouse and garage, a dedicated firehouse and heated multi-bay garage, usually described as having space for 7 vehicles. A village cluster, near the entrance a cluster of buildings, an older adobe house, offices, staff quarters, maintenance buildings that functioned as a kind of internal village, stables and horse facilities. Stables with horses used for riding by guests and staff, described in the trial testimony of Epstein's chief pilot. All of this is documented in county assessors' descriptions, real estate listings, when the property was offered for sale after Epstein's death, and in witness testimony during the Maxwell trial. When pilot Larry Visosky was asked in federal court to describe Zorro Ranch for the jury, he called it a roughly 10,000-acre property with its own runway, hangar, lodge, modular home, and stables. He testified that he flew Epstein, Maxwell, and guests there multiple times a year, and that Epstein even gave him acreage nearby as a perk. The picture is consistent. This was not a rustic spread with a farmhouse and a few cattle. This was an engineered environment, luxury residence. Dedicated aviation facilities, self-contained services designed to host people in a very private way. State trust land, the 1,200-acre buffer. Beyond the private land, there's another layer of property that matters. The public land Epstein was allowed to use. Fact: around the core of Zorro Ranch, The New Mexico State Land Office leased approximately 1,200 to 1,243 acres of state trust land to Epstein's Virgin Islands Company, Cypress Incorporated. These leases date back to the early 1990s, roughly contemporaneous with his purchase of the ranch. On paper, these were livestock grazing leases. In theory, Cypress Incorporated was a ranching operation, running cattle on state land. But when New Mexico officials went back and reviewed the leases after Epstein's 2019 arrest, they saw something else. The state's land commissioner, Stephanie Garcia Richard, would later describe the trust parcels as a privacy buffer for the ranch. Her office's review found very little, if any, substantive grazing activity, repeated difficulties gaining access to the land to perform inspections, even though state law gives the land office the right to enter trust lands. What the Attorney General's office would call misinterpretations in lease paperwork about how the land would be used. From the standpoint of an investigator, that buffer matters. It meant that a ring of public land, land that theoretically belongs to the state's school children, was being used to keep the public, and at times the state inspectors, further away from Epstein's private domain. We'll come back to how those leases were canceled in 2019 and what that cancellation did and did not accomplish in Part 3. The corporate structure of Zorro Trust and Cypress Incorporated. For many years, the ranch was simply known as one of Epstein's personal properties. Over time, he moved it into a more opaque structure. Fact, the property was ultimately controlled through a combination of Zorro Trust and Cypress Incorporated, both linked to Epstein and, in Cypress's case, based in the U.S. Virgin Islands. The New Mexico State Land Office explicitly identifies Cypress Incorporated as the lessee on the state trust land around Zorro Ranch, a company owned by convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein, and listed as the owner of the ranch's private acreage in Santa Fe County records. This corporate shell did two things. It put legal title at one more remove from Epstein personally. It connected the New Mexico property to his wider network of offshore and Virgin Island entities, the same network that later came under scrutiny in the Virgin Islands civil case. For our purposes, the key point is Cypress Incorporated is the name on the land records, and that name later becomes central to the lease cancellations and to understanding who New Mexico could actually act against after Epstein's death. The zoning, agriculture, and reality. On paper, Zorro Ranch looked like a ranch. It had grazing leases. It had a rural footprint. That mattered for zoning and land purposes. In practice, the state land office found little evidence of meaningful cattle operations on the trust land. The land commissioner, Garcia Richard, publicly described it as not your typical ranching operation and pointed heavy security and restricted access. Public descriptions when the estate tried to sell the property don't dwell on agriculture. They dwell on privacy, luxury, and seclusion. The mismatch between the agricultural label and the actual use of the land is important. It was central to the land office's legal rationale for canceling the leases. It also goes to one of the big questions in this story. Was the state's machinery, its land office, its zoning, its enforcement culture used deliberately or not to help create and maintain a hidden space for potential crimes? We can't answer that fully yet, but we can say the state wrote leases for grazing, or quote-unquote grazing. Epstein used the land to wrap a private luxury compound in a layer of state property, and for over 2 decades, no one in authority pulled hard enough on that thread to unravel the arrangement until after his second arrest. The disposition, sale, and rebranding. After Epstein's death and the creation of his estate, Zorro Ranch became an asset to be liquidated. Fact. In 2021, the estate listed the ranch for sale at an asking price of $27.5 million. When it didn't move, the price was lowered. Eventually, in 2023, it sold to a newly formed New Mexico limited liability company called San Rafael Ranch, LLC. San Rafael Ranch, LLC is managed by a Santa Fe lawyer on behalf of unnamed client or clients. Public filings do not reveal the ultimate beneficial owners. The new owners have reportedly renamed the property Rancho de San Rafael. There is no public evidence that the new owners have any connection to Epstein or his circle. For the purposes of this historical record, their identities matter only to this question. Will they cooperate if a future commission or investigation seeks access to the property or to any records they may have inherited with the sale? That remains an open question. For now, we can close part 2 with this. Zorro Ranch was structurally a three-layered thing. 1. A massive purpose-built private complex. 2. Surrounded in part by state trust land functioning as a privacy buffer. 3. Wrapped in corporate shells that tied it into Epstein's wider network of offshore entities. Every one of those layers generated paper, leases, deeds, and correspondence. In part 3, we follow that paper into the hands of New Mexico's law enforcement and political institutions, and watch what they did, and crucially, did not do with it. State and federal paper trail. If part 2 gave us the physical stage, part 3 introduces the actors in government who had the power to walk onto it. The State Land Office, the Attorney General's office, and, in the background, federal prosecutors in New York. We'll start in July 2019 with a land commissioner and a stack of lease files. The 400-page packet, State Land Office to Attorney General. On July 16, 2019, less than 2 weeks after Epstein was arrested in New York, the New Mexico State Land Office issued a public statement. Fact. The Land Office announced it had compiled and transmitted more than 400 pages of documents related to Jeffrey Epstein's Zorro Ranch to the New Mexico Attorney General's office. Those documents included the original 1990s grazing leases with Cypress Incorporated, renewal documents and amendments, correspondence between Land Office staff and Epstein's representatives, records of improvements, inspections attempted, and internal notes about access problems. In other words, the Land Office pulled its entire file on Zorro Ranch and handed it to the state's top prosecutor. The stated reasons were twofold: to support any criminal investigation into the possible abuse at the ranch, to determine whether the leases themselves had been obtained or maintained through fraud or misrepresentation. This matters because it shows that at least at the level of the Land Office, officials understood very quickly that Epstein's New Mexico property was part of the story, and that the state had its own paper trail independent of whatever the FBI had. Inspection denied and leases canceled. The next significant move came a few weeks later, and it was administrative, not criminal. Fact. In late August and early September 2019, after reviewing the leases with the Attorney General's staff, Land Commissioner Stephanie Garcia Richard announced she would seek to cancel the grazing leases held by Cypress Incorporated on the state trust land surrounding Zorro Ranch. Her office's stated grounds included obstruction of inspection. Land Office staff had repeatedly been unable to access trust land inside the ranch perimeter. Phone calls and messages requesting access were not returned or were deflected. When staff did attempt to enter, they encountered gates and instructions limiting where they can go. Written misrepresentation. Information provided by Cypress Incorporated in lease paperwork was, in the state's view, false or misleading about the company's use of the land. Improper purpose. After review, the Attorney General's office concluded the leases may have been obtained through illegitimate means for purposes other than ranching or agriculture. Under New Mexico law, the commissioner can cancel a grazing lease for obstruction of access or misrepresentation. That's what happened. A formal cancellation notice was sent to Cypress Incorporated. Cypress initially contested the cancellation, filing a petition in state court. Within weeks, facing public attention and legal risk, Cypress and the Land Office reached a settlement. The company agreed to accept the cancellations effective October 4th, 2019. It dropped its court challenge. From that point forward, Epstein's company no longer had the legal right to use those 12,000 acres of state land as an extension of Zorro Ranch. This is a meaningful act, but it is also a narrow one. It addressed the state-owned buffer, not the privately owned core of the ranch. It sent a message about misuse of the public land, but it did not penetrate the compound itself. And it shows us that by fall 2019, at least one agency in New Mexico was willing to go on record saying this arrangement was not what it was represented to be. We were not allowed to see what we were supposed to be able to see. Those are the kinds of red flags that in other contexts often accompany deeper criminal investigations. The Balderas investigation, New Mexico as fact gatherer. At the same time the Land Office was pulling together its files, the office of then Attorney General Hector Balderas was quietly doing its own work. Fact. According to senior staff later interviewed by local reporters, the Attorney General's office opened a criminal investigation into Jeffrey Epstein's activities in New Mexico in early 2019, months before his arrest in New York. Investigators in the AG's Special Investigations Division identified and interviewed at least 2 women who said they had been abused or trafficked at Zorro Ranch, reviewed potential state-level charges including criminal sexual contact of a minor, possible conspiracy or accomplice liability for others, began assembling materials, witness statements, documents, and the land office packets to share with federal authorities. Publicly, Balderas' office described its role in careful, almost modest terms. Again and again, spokespeople emphasize that the Southern District of New York was leading the federal case. New Mexico's job was to act as a fact gatherer and then to provide its materials to SDNY. This is what happened. When SDNY indicted Epstein in July 2019, New Mexico did not rush out with its own charges. After Epstein's death in 2019, Balderas' office confirmed that its criminal investigation had been closed without charges and that its materials had been shared with federal prosecutors. From the outside, this looks like deference. A state with some evidence, the land office file, interviews with women, flight log corroboration, is positioned behind a federal case that then collapses when the defendant dies. What we don't see is a pivot to a New Mexico-only indictment, an aggressive state-level move to search and process Zorro Ranch as a crime scene on its own authority. We'll talk later about the implications of that choice. For now, the key takeaway is New Mexico's Attorney General's office did investigate. It gathered some victim statements, it reviewed options, but it ultimately allowed the gravity of the case to stay in New York and did not independently move on the ranch. The Torres era, banking settlements, not ranch searches. In 2023, Hector Balderas left office. His successor, Raul Torres, inherited the Epstein file in a very different context. Epstein was dead. Maxwell had been indicted and then convicted in New York. Major civil cases were underway in the Virgin Islands and elsewhere, focusing on the financial and institutional enablers of Epstein's network. Torres' office took a different tack. Fact. Rather than reopen a closed criminal investigation into Epstein himself, Torres focused on financial institutions that, in his office's view, had facilitated or failed to detect trafficking-related activity tied to New Mexico. This led to settlements with banks, including a New Mexico component, of a broader resolution with Dutch Bank that set aside roughly $17 million for anti-trafficking work and victim services in the state. Public statements explicitly linking that money to failures in monitoring accounts and transactions connected to Epstein's Zorro Ranch. In other words, the new Attorney General treated Zorro Ranch less as a live crime scene and more as a symbol of how financial systems can enable exploitation, a hook to bring in resources to fight trafficking more broadly. That approach brought money and policy attention. It did not bring a forensic team through the gates. The proposed Truth Commission. By 2025, frustration with the piecemeal nature of the record, the partial investigations, the redacted files, the absence of a single authoritative narrative had made its way into the New Mexico legislature. Fact, in late 2025, state representatives publicly proposed creating a New Mexico Truth Commission on Jeffrey Epstein, with a specific mandate to investigate what happened at Zorro Ranch, what state and local officials knew and when, how the state's registries, land use decisions, and criminal justice systems responded or failed to respond. The proposal envisions a bipartisan body with 4 legislative members, 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, and potentially outside experts, subpoena power to compel testimony and records from state agencies, the Attorney General, Land Office, Department of Public Safety, local law enforcement, private individuals with knowledge of the ranch, a budget on the order of several $1 million to staff and support the inquiry. The members behind the proposal have been explicit about the gap they're trying to fill. As one put it in an interview, there is still no complete public record of what occurred in New Mexico. As of the date of this episode, the commission is still a proposal, not an established body, but its very existence on the political agenda is an admission that the Balderas criminal investigation did not answer the key questions, that the Torres financial settlements did not answer them either, and that no one, state, federal, or local, has yet done the public-facing work of pulling together New Mexico's part of the Epstein story. That is, in effect, what we are doing here. With the tools we have, public records, court files, reliable reporting, and survivor testimony. Jurisdictional gaps, state, federal, and the sex offender registry. There's one more thread in the New Mexico paper trail that has to be mentioned because it shaped how Epstein was treated in that state long before 2019. Fact, in 2008, Jeffrey Epstein pleaded guilty in Florida state court to 2 prostitution-related offenses involving a minor. He served roughly 13 months in a local jail, much of it on a work release program. As part of that plea, he had to register as a sex offender. He did so in Florida. He did so in New York. For a brief moment, he did so in New Mexico. And then something happened. 2 days after his initial registration, New Mexico's Department of Public Safety removed Epstein's file from the state's sex offender list. Why? Because under New Mexico law at the time, for certain non-contact sex offenses, registry was only required if the victim was under 16. The paperwork New Mexico received from Florida described Epstein's victim as 17. On that basis, New Mexico officials concluded he was not required to register in their state. Later reporting, especially from the Miami Herald's Perversion of Justice series, would show that the victim at the heart of the Florida plea was actually 16. The age discrepancy appears to have been the result of how Florida authorities summarized or transmitted the case information, not an independent fact-finding by New Mexico. But the effect was clear. New Mexico had a convicted sex offender who owned a sprawling, isolated compound in its jurisdiction, and on paper, for almost a decade, he was not listed in New Mexico as a sex offender. When Balderas took office in 2015, he publicly criticized the state's weak registration laws and cited the Epstein situation as an example of how they could fail, but there was no retroactive fix. From a jurisdictional perspective, this registry decision did 3 things. 1, it made it less likely that local deputies, neighbors, or service providers would see Epstein through the lens of a convicted sex offender when interacting with him around the ranch. 2, it signaled intentionally or not a certain hands-off stance toward his presence in New Mexico. 3, it showed that New Mexico's legal framework was out of step with the multi-state, multi-jurisdictional reality of his crimes. When we talk later about institutional failures and inaction, this registry episode will be one of the anchor points. We've now set up the landscape. In part 1, we established Zorro Ranch as a real, physical place at the center of a glaring law enforcement mission. In part 2, we mapped the property, the mansion, the airstrip, the state land buffer, the corporate ownership. In part 3, we traced how New Mexico's own institutions handled their Epstein files, from the land office's 400-page packet and lease cancellations, through Balderas' limited criminal probe and Torres's banking settlements, to the tentative step toward a truth commission. In the next installment, we'll turn to part 4 and part 5, the court cases and survivor testimony that mention the ranch by name. We'll go into the unsealed civil case of Giuffre versus Maxwell, the Maxwell criminal trial, the 2019 federal case against Epstein, and the 2024 document releases. Then we'll hear, in detail, from the women and girls who said they were taken to Zorro Ranch, and match their accounts line by line against the travel records and timelines. We've set the stage, an isolated aviation-enabled compound, a ring of state land used as a buffer, a chain of state and federal decisions that never culminated in a full search. Now we turn to the legal record, the court cases where Zorro Ranch appears, and the ones where it conspicuously does not. And after that, we'll hear from the people whose lives intersected with this place, the survivors and witnesses whose testimony names New Mexico. Court cases and legal record. When you look at the Epstein saga from a distance, it can blur together. Florida, New York, Paris, the private island, the Lolita Express. Famous names. To make sense of Zorro Ranch, we have to break that blur into specific cases. A civil defamation suit, Giuffre versus Maxwell in New York. A federal criminal case against Maxwell, United States versus Ghislaine Maxwell. The short-lived federal indictment of Epstein in 2019, the earlier non-prosecution agreement in Florida, and finally, the wave of unsealed documents in 2024 and 2025. We'll walk through each and pause whenever New Mexico or Zorro Ranch appears. Giuffre versus Maxwell, the defamation case that opened the files. We begin in 2015. Fact, in September of that year, Virginia Giuffre, then Virginia Roberts, filed a civil lawsuit in the Southern District of New York, Virginia L. Giuffre versus Ghislaine Maxwell, case number 15 CV 7433. The claim was defamation. Giuffre alleged that court-documented claim Ghislaine Maxwell had publicly accused her of lying, obvious lies in Maxwell's words, when Giuffre said that Epstein and Maxwell had sexually abused her and trafficked her to powerful men. By choosing defamation, Giuffre did something very specific. She forced the truth or falsity of her underlying abuse story into the center of the case. Maxwell could not defend herself without implicitly or explicitly contesting Guthrie's description of the trafficking network. The lawsuit generated hundreds of docket entries, a protective order sealing much of the record during the litigation, years of discovery, including depositions of Epstein's staff and of Maxwell herself. The case settled in 2017. For a time, those materials sat in sealed boxes, literal and metaphorical. Then the dam began to break. Several media organizations, including the Miami Herald, intervened to seek access to the sealed documents. Over several years, Judge Loretta Preska, who inherited the case after the settlement, ordered waves of unsealing. By early 2024, thousands of pages had been released in batches. Those documents are critical to the Zorro Ranch story in three ways. One, they confirm that Epstein's property formed a multi-site circuit of travel and abuse. Two, they show how New Mexico appears in survivor narratives and correspondence. Three, they identify categories of people, staff, pilots, associates who were part of that circuit. Let's unpack that. Court-documented claim. In her complaint and deposition, Guthrie describes being brought into Epstein's world around the year 2000. At age 16 or 17, and being trafficked to the Palm Beach mansion, Epstein's townhouse in Manhattan, Little St. James, his private island, London, and yes, New Mexico, to a ranch she calls Zorro Ranch. She recounts being lent out to powerful men, naming, among others, Prince Andrew, former Senator George Mitchell from New Mexico, former New Mexico Governor Bill Richardson, and attorney Alan Dershowitz. She alleges that Maxwell was central to this process, recruiting, normalizing, scheduling, and sometimes physically participating in the abuse. All of this appears in sworn deposition transcripts and related filings in the Guthrie case. Now, a crucial qualification. Allegation. The claims that specific named men committed sex acts with Guthrie at Zorro Ranch or elsewhere remain allegations. None of those men have been criminally charged in New Mexico in connection with her account. Each has, in public statements, denied the accusations in emphatic terms. What the case does give us, without ambiguity, is evidence that New Mexico and the ranch were part of the geography of Guthrie's trafficking narrative. Photographs of Guthrie as a teenager in New Mexico standing near the entrance of the ranch, visiting local attractions like Georgia O'Keeffe Museum in Santa Fe that align with her timeline. Those photos have been widely reproduced, and they became part of the reason New Mexico officials went back to search their own records. They are one of the bridges between a civil case in New York and a remote property in Santa Fe County. We'll come back to Guthrie's personal story in part 5. For now, the key point is this. Guthrie versus Maxwell turned New Mexico from a rumor into a named location in sworn court documents, tied to a specific survivor's account of trafficking. United States versus Ghislaine Maxwell, New Mexico in a federal criminal trial. Next, we move from civil litigation to a criminal courtroom. Fact: in July 2020, federal prosecutors in the Southern District of New York indicted Ghislaine Maxwell in case number 20 CR 330. The charges included conspiracy to entice minors to travel to engage in illegal sex acts, conspiracy to transport minors for illegal sexual activity, transporting minors with intent to engage in criminal sexual activity, sex trafficking of a minor, and related conspiracy accounts. The indictment covered conduct from roughly 1994 to 2004, centered on Manhattan, Palm Beach, and indirectly properties like Little St. James and other residences. New Mexico was not listed as a separate count or jurisdiction for charging purposes, but it entered the case through evidence. In late 2021, the case went to trial. The prosecution called 4 main accusers. Each used a pseudonym in court, except one, Annie Farmer, who chose to testify under her real name. Her account is our clearest window into Zorro Ranch in a criminal proceeding. Survivor testimony. Farmer told the jury she met Epstein in 1995 through her older sister Maria. She was 16. Epstein invited her to New York for what was pitched as an educational trip. In New York, she testified, he took her to a movie, sat next to her, and held her hand and massaged her leg and foot, behavior that made her uncomfortable. Later, She said Maxwell and Epstein invited her to a ranch in New Mexico for a weekend that was supposed to involve other students. When she arrived, she was the only young person there. She described being shown around the property, a large house in the desert with its own runway and horses, being given gifts and attention, being encouraged to feel grateful and special. One night, she told the jury, she went to bed in a guest room. Epstein came into the room and got into bed with her and pressed his body against her, saying he wanted to cuddle. She froze, then told him she had to use the bathroom, escaped, and closed the door. Later, she said Maxwell offered her a massage. She instructed Annie to undress and lie face down. She pulled down the sheet to expose Annie's breasts. She massaged Annie's bare chest and breasts, according to Annie's testimony. Farmer described feeling frozen, confused, and violated. She was 16 years old. The trial judge allowed this New Mexico testimony, even though New Mexico's age of consent, 16, meant that the specific contact described, if isolated, was not itself a crime under New Mexico law. The judge's instruction to the jury was clear. They were to treat this evidence as part of a pattern of grooming and sexual exploitation, relevant to showing Maxwell's intent and modus operandi in the charged counts. In other words, New Mexico was not a count of the indictment. Zorro Ranch was part of the story the government told the jury about how Epstein and Maxwell operated. Alongside Annie's account, the prosecution also called pilot Larry Visosky, Epstein's longtime chief pilot. Under oath, Visosky described flying Epstein, Maxwell, and various guests to New Mexico many times a year, landing at Santa Fe and at times using the ranch's private airstrip, seeing young women and girls on board, some of whom he believed to be minors, receiving 40 acres of land on or near the ranch from Epstein as a gift, on which he built a home. His testimony confirmed what the land records and satellite images already showed. Zorro Ranch was a regularly used node in Epstein's network of properties. He was connected to that network by private aircraft and cooperative staff. At the end of the trial, the jury convicted Maxwell on 5 of 6 counts, including sex trafficking of a minor and conspiracy charges. The New Mexico episodes played a supporting role, not charged as separate crimes, but woven into the fabric of the case as examples of grooming and exploitation. For our purposes, the Maxwell trial does something the earlier Florida deal did not. It places Zorro Ranch inside a proven criminal pattern, not just in survivor narratives. It anchors that pattern in both testimonial evidence, Annie Farmer and pilots, and documentary evidence, flight logs and photographs. United States versus Jeffrey Epstein, the 2019 SDNY indictment. Now, we rewind to the last months of Epstein's life. Fact. In 2019, federal prosecutors in SDNY charged Epstein with sex trafficking of minors and conspiracy to commit sex trafficking in a case labeled 19 CR 490. The indictment focused on a conduct from 2002 to 2005 and on 2 jurisdictions, New York and Florida. It alleged that Epstein maintained a vast network of minor victims, primarily 14 to 17 years old. He used his properties in Manhattan and Palm Beach as hubs for abuse and recruitment. He paid certain victims to recruit other girls. The indictment did not include New Mexico or Zorro Ranch as separate counts. During the bail hearing and subsequent proceedings, however, victims and their lawyers spoke in broader terms. Women described being flown to Epstein's island, being abused in multiple locations. Some mentioned a ranch in New Mexico, though those references did not become formal elements of the indictment. Before SDNY could expand or amend the charges, Epstein died in his jail cell in August 2019. The case was dismissed by operation of law, because a dead defendant cannot be tried. The legal effect was stark. The only federal criminal indictment directly naming Epstein as a trafficker died with him. It did not reach Zorro Ranch. Even though other proceedings, civil lawsuits, later the Maxwell trial, would place New Mexico firmly within the larger pattern. From a historical standpoint, this means there's no federal criminal record that fully integrates Zorro Ranch into the charging narrative. The facts about New Mexico had to come in through other channels: civil litigation, state-level statements, and Maxwell's prosecution. The Florida non-prosecution agreement, backdrop, and consequences. We can't talk about what happened in New Mexico without talking about what didn't happen in Florida in 2007 and 2008. Fact. In 2007, as federal prosecutors in the Southern District of Florida investigated allegations that Epstein had sexually abused dozens of underage girls in and around Palm Beach, they negotiated a non-prosecution agreement with his lawyers. The deal, approved by the U.S. Attorney Alexander Acosta, did several things. It allowed Epstein to plead guilty in Florida state court to 2 prostitution-related counts. It required him to serve a county jail sentence, ultimately about 13 months, much of it on a work-release program that let him leave the facility up to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. It required him to register as a sex offender, and most controversially, it bound the federal government not to prosecute Epstein or any potential co-conspirators identified in the investigation. Later court rulings would find that the victims in the Florida case were not properly informed of this agreement, in violation of their rights. Public outrage over the deal would help bring the entire Epstein story back into view a decade later. For New Mexico, the non-prosecution agreement had 2 major effects. 1, it left Epstein free, wealthy, and mobile, still in control of Zorro Ranch and other properties, without the kind of long federal sentence that could have permanently disrupted his operations. 2, it framed him, on paper, as someone who pleaded to comparatively narrow state charges, rather than as the head of a multi-state trafficking enterprise. When New Mexico authorities later evaluated his status for sex offender registration, they looked mostly at the Florida plea, the Florida police paperwork summarizing that plea. That paperwork said the victim was 17. New Mexico's then current law for the relevant category of offense only required registration if the victim was under 16. On that basis, the state decided he did not need to register. In this way, a lenient, secretive federal deal in Florida intersected with a narrow state statute in New Mexico to produce a striking outcome. A man who was a registered sex offender in Florida and New York for years, not treated as such in New Mexico, even as he continued to use Zorro Ranch. That's not a direct legal tie between the NPA and the ranch, but it is a clear line of causation in the background. A decision in one jurisdiction made it easier for Epstein to move quietly into another. The 2024-2025 Epstein files unsealing. Finally, we should note the most recent developments in the record. Fact, beginning in late 2023 and continuing into 2024 and 5, federal judges in New York have overseen the release of large volumes of previously sealed Epstein and Maxwell-related documents, including batches of unsealed documents from Giuffre versus Maxwell, portions of grand jury and investigative materials from the Epstein and Maxwell criminal cases, records released under a new federal law, sometimes referred to as the Epstein Files Transparency Framework. These materials include more detailed flight records, more internal FBI and DOJ communications, more deposition transcripts from staff and associates. In the material publicly described so far, there's no bombshell revelation that changes the basic New Mexico narrative. Instead, these documents fill in names and dates along existing routes, confirm that Santa Fe and New Mexico appear as regular destinations for Epstein's aircraft, reiterate in bureaucratic language what survivors have said for years, that Epstein used his properties as a network. The full impact of these releases is still unfolding. For Zorro Ranch, the key question is, will any of these documents reveal why, in 2019, federal authorities chose not to execute a visible raid or search warrant at the ranch? So far, we don't have that answer. What we do have is enough to move from the legal scaffolding to the human core of this history. We've seen how New Mexico appears in lawsuits and indictments. Now, we turn to the people those documents are built around. Survivor and witness testimony. In this part, you'll hear from the women whose names and stories have surfaced in connection with Zorro Ranch and Epstein's New Mexico activities. For each of them, we'll be careful to mark what they said under oath versus what they said in interviews, what has been tested in court versus what remains unadjudicated, how their accounts line up with the travel and property records we've already seen. We start with Virginia Giuffre, because her civil case unlocks so much of the evidentiary record. Then we move to Maria and Annie Farmer, Shantae Davies, and a set of Jane Does whose stories intersect with the ranch. We'll also note non-victim witnesses like pilots and officials, where their statements shed light on the ranch's operations. Virginia Giuffre, formerly known as Virginia Roberts. Who she is. Virginia Giuffre, born Virginia Roberts in 1983, became one of the most visible Epstein survivors. She is central to the public understanding of his trafficking network. She filed civil suits, gave sworn depositions, and spoke extensively to journalists. She died in April 2025 after years of advocacy on behalf of trafficking victims. Her testimony remains part of the permanent legal record, survivor testimony, and core narrative. Giuffre has consistently described a pattern that began in Florida and spread outward. As a teenager working at Mar-a-Lago, she was recruited by Maxwell and another woman to give Epstein a massage. That encounter turned into sexual abuse. From there, Epstein and Maxwell drew her into a role where she was abused by Epstein multiple times a day, often under the guise of massages. She was pressured to recruit other girls. She was taken on Epstein's private planes to New York, his private island, London, and New Mexico, among other destinations. In civil filings and interviews, she has said that Epstein and Maxwell trafficked her as a sex slave between these properties. She was lent out to powerful men in those locations, including, in some accounts, at Zorro Ranch. Again, those specific allegations against named men are contested and unadjudicated, but her description of being moved between properties by private jet is supported by hard data, court-documented claims involving New Mexico. In Giuffre versus Maxwell, Virginia's complaint and her 2016 deposition make several points that matter here. She lists New Mexico and Epstein's ranch among the places she was trafficked. She describes travel to the ranch in New Mexico as part of the rotation of properties. She maintains that Maxwell was an active participant, arranging travel, normalizing sexual contact, and sometimes taking part in the abuse. Because Giuffre's lawsuit was about defamation, the court did not reach formal findings on each of her substantive abuse claims. The case settled, but the testimony itself stands as sworn survivor evidence. How the logs line up. The detailed flight logs from the 1990s and early 2000s, introduced later in the Maxwell case, show Giuffre under the name Virginia Roberts, or Roberts, Virginia, on numerous legs. Teterboro to Palm Beach, Teterboro to St. Thomas, multi-stop Europe and Caribbean trips. Some researchers have tied her to at least one Santa Fe leg, noting a cluster of flights where Roberts, Virginia appears in proximity to New Mexico segments. In public summaries, however, the clearest, fully documented log entries for her relate to New York, Florida, and the Virgin Islands. So we have strong corroboration that she was a frequent passenger on Epstein's jets during the critical 2000 to 2002 period. Pattern level support for her claim that she was cycled through multiple properties. More tentative but consistent, supporting evidence for her New Mexico travel, reinforced by photographs of her in Santa Fe and near the ranch. Her specific allegations that she was abused by named men at Zorro Ranch remain in the categories of court-documented claims and allegations, not adjudicated facts. Maria Farmer and Annie Farmer. Next, we turn to a family, two sisters whose lives intersected with Epstein in the mid-1990s. Maria Farmer. Maria Farmer was an artist and briefly part of Epstein's social and quasi-professional circle. In the mid-1990s, she worked on art projects associated with him and with Leslie Wexner, the billionaire retail magnate and close Epstein associate. Survivor testimony from Maria. Maria has said in detailed affidavits and interviews that in 1996 she was sexually assaulted by Epstein and Maxwell at Wexner's estate in Ohio. That same year, Epstein became interested in commissioning art for his New Mexico property, and Maria discussed or worked on related projects. She came to understand that her younger sister Annie, whom Epstein had met through Maria, was also being groomed. She reported the Ohio assault and concerns about Annie to the FBI in 1996. Nothing happened. Annie Farmer. Annie's story we have already heard briefly in the context of the Maxwell trial. Now we'll focus on it as a survivor testimony tied directly to Zorro Ranch. Survivor testimony, civil and criminal. In both her civil complaint filed in 2019 against Epstein's estate and Maxwell, and her sworn testimony at Maxwell's 2021 trial, Annie described meeting Epstein in New Mexico when she was 16. After Maria introduced them, being invited to New York for a college tour and cultural experiences, being then invited to his ranch in New Mexico for what was described as a program for gifted, high-achieving students. When she arrived at the ranch, she found no other students. She testified that Epstein took her shopping, bought her gifts, and had casual physical contact that made her uneasy. He came into her bedroom at night, got into bed with her, and pressed himself against her under the covers. Later, Maxwell offered her a massage, told her to undress, and massaged her, pulling down the sheet and massaging her bare breasts. These episodes are the core of her Zorro Ranch account. Court-documented claims and adjudication. Annie's description of what happened at the ranch is present in her 2019 civil complaint where she sues Epstein's estate, Maxwell, and other entities for damages. Her sworn testimony at Maxwell's trial, where she was cross-examined by Maxwell's defense team. In the criminal case, the jury clearly credited her testimony as part of the pattern of grooming and abuse that supported Maxwell's conviction. No court has separately adjudicated the New Mexico conduct as a state crime, but in terms of credibility and legal weight, Annie's account of Zorro Ranch stands on firmer ground than almost any other. It's backed by multiple witnesses, her sister, her mother, her then-boyfriend, who said she told them about the trip at the time. It fits the travel patterns documented in the flight logs. A federal jury heard it, along with cross-examination, and convicted Maxwell. If you want to know, from an evidentiary standpoint, whether sexualized grooming and boundary crossing happened at Zorro Ranch, Annie Farmer's testimony is your clearest line. Shantae Davies. Shantae Davies is another key survivor whose story intersects with Epstein's aircraft, and indirectly his properties. Who she is. Davies was a massage therapist and an aspiring actress who, as a young woman, was brought into Epstein's orbit as a masseuse. She later became effectively part of his traveling staff, accompanying him on flights and trips. Survivor testimony. Davies has said in interviews and filings that she was groomed by Epstein with initial, legitimate-seeming work turned into sexual abuse. She traveled with him extensively, including to Palm Beach, New York, the U.S. Virgin Islands, international destinations. She is described being raped and coerced multiple times across different locations. Corroboration from logs and images. In one of the most publicized episodes, Davies flew with Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell, President Bill Clinton, Kevin Spacey, and Chris Tucker on an Africa tour in 2002. Flight logs list her by name on multiple legs of that trip. Photographs from the plane and on the ground, widely published in 2019 and 2020, show her massaging Clinton's shoulders, in a scene she has later described in interviews. These materials don't place her specifically at Zorro Ranch, but they do cement her status as a frequent passenger on Epstein's planes, present at high-profile trips, and credible when she says she was being exploited within that travel network. There are secondary reports and advocacy documents that suggest Davies was among those abused at the New Mexico ranch. Without a clear, named New Mexico leg in the core flight log releases, or a detailed, attributable interview in which she narrates her time at Zorro Ranch, her New Mexico connection remains in the category of reported but not fully documented. Jane Does and Priscilla Doe. Beyond the named survivors, there is a constellation of Jane Doe plaintiffs whose cases mention New Mexico. Priscilla Doe. In 2019, several new civil suits were filed against Epstein's estate by plaintiffs using pseudonyms like Caitlin Doe, Lisa Doe, and Priscilla Doe. In public summaries of those complaints, court-documented claim, Priscilla Doe alleged that Epstein coerced her into sex acts at multiple locations, including Zorro Ranch in New Mexico between roughly 2007 and 2010. She described being flown there as part of the same patterns seen elsewhere: private jets, isolation, and pressure to comply. These suits did not go to trial in open court, so we don't have cross-examination transcripts. Many were resolved through the estate's compensation program or confidential settlements. Their value, for our purposes, is cumulative. They show that multiple women, independently, have identified Zorro Ranch as a site of abuse in sworn complaints. They extend the alleged time frame of abuse at the ranch beyond the 1990s and into the 2000s. Jane Doe 10. No one gets in trouble for anything here. At an August 2019 hearing in SDNY, a kind of final session to formally dismiss Epstein's criminal case after his death, Judge Richard Berman invited survivors to speak. One anonymized survivor, referred to in coverage as Jane Doe 10, described being at Epstein's ranch, riding an ATV and crashing it. Panicked, she expected to be in trouble. Instead, she recalled someone, staff or Epstein himself, telling her, "No one gets in trouble for anything here." It's a single line, but in 6 words, it captures something survivors and observers have felt about Zorro Ranch all along, that it existed in a different legal atmosphere, an enclave where ordinary rules did not seem to apply. We do not know Jane Doe's tenant identity from the public record. We cannot tie her to a specific name in the logs, but her statement is part of the oral record of New Mexico as a perceived zone of impunity. Non-victim witnesses, pilots, and staff. So far, we focused on people who say they were abused, but other witnesses help us understand how Zorro Ranch operated. Larry Visosky, pilot. We've already heard from Visosky in the context of the Maxwell trial. He flew Epstein for about 25 years. He confirmed that he regularly flew to and from Santa Fe, and at times landed directly at the ranch's airstrip. He received land near the ranch as a gift. He also testified that he saw many young women and girls on the plane, some appearing to be minors. He usually did not know their names, and they were often listed generically in the logs. He never personally witnessed sexual acts. His evidence doesn't prove abuse, but it establishes a pattern of movement, the centrality of private aviation to making places like Zorro Ranch usable. Adam Perry Lang, the chef. As noted earlier, Chef Adam Perry Lang has acknowledged working as Epstein's private chef in the early 2000s. Deposition summaries and flight logs show him traveling on Epstein's jets, including to New Mexico. Lang has stated that he cooked meals, was not aware of the abuse at the time, has great sympathy for survivors. From an investigative standpoint, his significance is this. He was on-site staff at the Zorro Ranch during a period when survivor allegations place abuse there. He can speak to guest lists, routines, and the daily life of the ranch in ways that no document can. Ranch managers, Karen and Bryce Gordon. Public write-ups of the ranch identify a New Zealand couple, Karen and Bryce Gordon, as longtime managers of Zorro Ranch. They are alleged, in secondary reports, to have hosted parties at the ranch, hired local dancers or showgirls for entertainment, controlled physical access to the compound. These are allegations, not sworn testimony. The Gordons themselves have not, as far as the public records show, told their story under oath or on the record, but they know who came in, who was turned away, who enforced or ignored the rules. If a future commission ever wants to understand Zorro Ranch from the inside, the pilots, the chef, and the ranch managers are among the most important non-victim witnesses. We've now walked through the main court cases where New Mexico appears or is absent, the survivor witness testimony that names Zorro Ranch, how those accounts line up with travel records and property files. In the next part of this series, we'll focus on parts 6 and 7, the staffing, logistics, and operations that made Zorro Ranch function, the political and institutional shielding that allowed Epstein to own and use a high-security compound in New Mexico for decades, while remaining off the state's sex offender registry and out of the reach of any serious search. We'll look at who kept the planes moving, who managed the books, who benefited, and how the state's most basic safeguards failed to treat an already convicted sex offender as a risk at exactly the moment when he was using that freedom to move people in and out of the desert. Sorry to interrupt your regularly scheduled podcast, but this episode is brought to you by the Broken Truth merch. Support the show. Wear the truth. Official Broken Truth podcast merch is live now. Links in the description. And since you've made it this far in the episode, comment hashtag Broken Truth and leave us a 5-star review on your favorite platform. Because when you speak up, the algorithm listens. And so does the world. We've established the property, walked through the state and federal paper trail, and heard from survivors and witnesses whose lives intersected with the ranch. Now we're going to put the machinery around Epstein under the microscope, the staff, the logistics, the political systems, the media response, and finally, the long list of things that were never done. We'll then end with a clear matrix separating facts, court-documented claims, survivor testimony, allegations, and unknowns, and a conclusion about why this story still matters. Staff, logistics, and operations. Sex trafficking on the scale alleged around Jeffrey Epstein is not the work of one man. It's a system. Zorro Ranch was not a single house. It was an operation that depended on pilots, assistants, drivers, housekeepers, cooks, and local enablers. In this part, we'll look at how that operation functioned, as far as the public record lets us see. Staff categories at Zorro Ranch. Let's start by sketching out the major categories of people who kept the ranch running. Fact. Pilots. The most documented group is the pilots. Chief pilot Larry Visosky flew Epstein for roughly 25 years. In the Maxwell trial, he testified that he flew Epstein thousands of times, including frequent trips to New Mexico. Pilot David Rogers kept detailed handwritten logs for the Boeing 727 and other aircraft in the 1990s and early 2000s. These logs later admitted into evidence list departure and arrival airports, including Santa Fe, New Mexico, dates and flight numbers, passenger names and descriptors like female 1. Between them, the pilots provide a backbone for the story, a record of who went there, when, even if they didn't always write down every name. Fact: household and ranch staff. While fewer names are public, we know there were housekeepers and cleaners responsible for maintaining the main house and guest suites, cooks and kitchen staff, including at least one well-known chef, Adam Perry Lang, who has acknowledged working for Epstein in the early 2000s, and whose travel on the jets matches trips to Zorro Ranch, groundskeepers and maintenance staff maintaining the airstrip, irrigation, buildings, and stables, security personnel who controlled the gates and patrolled the property. Some of these roles mirror those we know from Palm Beach and New York, staff who signed non-disclosure agreements, followed Maxwell's rulebooks, and were told not to ask questions. Fact: ranch management couple. Public accounts identify a New Zealand couple, Karen and Bryce, or Bruce Gordon, as longtime managers or caretakers of Zorro Ranch. They lived on the ranch. They are described as coordinating operations on the ground. The allegations, secondary reporting, and one quoted local source claim that the Gordons hosted parties, recruited or hired local dancers and showgirls for events at the ranch. These claims have not been tested in court. The Gordons themselves have not provided sworn testimony in the public record. For now, their alleged recruitment role remains an allegation, not a fact. Fact: scheduling and inner circle staff. Across all Epstein properties, a small group of women functioned as schedulers, assistants, and in some cases, alleged co-conspirators. They appear repeatedly on flight logs and in civil complaints. Sarah Kellen, often listed on Manifest, described in multiple lawsuits as an assistant who scheduled massages and handled logistics. Nadia Marcinkova, an Epstein associate who appears on many flights and in some survivor accounts as both participant and facilitator. Emmy Taylor, a British assistant identified by several accusers and seen frequently on jets traveling to and from key locations. Fact: aggregated flight log analysis shows that Kellen Taylor and Marcinkova each appeared on multiple flights into and out of Santa Fe alongside Epstein and Maxwell. In some years, Maxwell's cluster of Santa Fe arrivals is in the dozens. Even without knowing exactly what they did at the ranch, the patterns show these women were not tied only to one house or one city. They were part of a mobile infrastructure that made the use of distant, isolated properties possible. How the operation functioned: massage, grooming, and routinization. To understand Zorro Ranch's role, we should first call the pattern that has been documented more fully in Florida, New York, and the Virgin Islands. Court-documented pattern. In those jurisdictions, police files, victim testimony, and court findings converge on a modus operandi. Recruitment, girls and young women, often from vulnerable backgrounds, were approached with offers of work, typically as masseuses or companions. Recruiters were sometimes other young women already caught in Epstein's orbit, sometimes adults incentivized to bring friends. Initial contact. New recruits were brought to one of Epstein's properties. A massage was requested, often with Maxwell or another woman present to normalize the situation. The encounter escalated into sexual contact. Grooming and conditioning. Epstein or Maxwell offered gifts, money, education promises, or travel. Boundaries were tested and pushed incrementally. Victims were made to feel both special and dependent. Scaling up. Some victims were asked to bring other girls. The process became routinized. Multiple massages per day with a rotation of victims and a stable of enablers. Now, take that pattern and overlay it on Zorro Ranch. Survivor testimony from Annie Farmer. The New Mexico trip is framed as a reward and opportunity, an educational weekend at a private ranch. She is isolated, no other teens, only Epstein, Maxwell, and adult staff. Epstein's behavior, cuddling in bed, pressing his body against hers, is sexualized but cloaked in the language of affection. Maxwell's topless massage is framed as nurturing but crosses intimate boundaries. This is textbook grooming, using the rural isolation of the ranch rather than the social isolation of a big city townhouse. Survivor testimony from Goofrey and others. For older teens and young women, Zorro Ranch appears less as an introduction point and more as one stop in a circuit. New York to Zorro Ranch to the island and back to Palm Beach. Private jets making those legs feel like commuting between rooms. Allegation: Jane and Doe filings. Several Jane Doe plaintiffs describe being trafficked to a New Mexico ranch where they were coerced into sex acts, sometimes with third parties. The consistent elements across different properties are controlled access, secrecy, a vocabulary that turned abuse into work or massages, staff who knew enough to book flights and prepare rooms, but in many cases now claim not to have known the details of what happened behind closed doors. The travel logistics, getting to and from the desert. Let's walk through how a typical trip to Zorro Ranch appears to have worked, based on flight logs and testimony. Step 1. Departure from a hub. Most trips begin at one of the few key airports. Teterboro Airport in New Jersey, serving the New York metro area. Palm Beach International in Florida. Occasionally Van Nuys or Los Angeles on the West Coast. Passengers would board Epstein's Boeing 727 or Gulfstream jet. The manifests often list Epstein, Maxwell, one or more assistants, Kellen, Marcinova, or Taylor, a mix of adult guests, business associates, friends, sometimes recognizable names, females and males generically described, in addition to any fully named passengers. Step 2. Flight into New Mexico. From there, the aircraft would fly to Santa Fe or in some cases nearby airports in New Mexico or West Texas. For example, a 1997 flight carrying Jane from Teterboro to Santa Fe with Epstein and Maxwell on board. 1999 flights where Epstein and high-end interior designer Alberto Pinto traveled between Teterboro, Santa Fe, and Van Nuys. Early 2000s patterns where Epstein and his inner circle fly from West Palm Beach to Santa Fe and back. Step 3. Transfer to the ranch. Once in Santa Fe, passengers could travel by car, roughly an hour's drive to the ranch, or for some trips by smaller aircraft or helicopter to the ranch's own airstrip. We know from testimony that Epstein's pilots sometimes flew directly into the ranch's strip. Local drivers and vehicles moved passengers from airports to the ranch gate. Step 4. The life inside. Once at Zorro Ranch, guests entered a highly controlled environment. No neighbors close enough to see or hear much. Staff who worked for Epstein or the ranch company. Communications and transport under his control. Survivors describe being shown the property, the house, the horses, and the views. Being given clothes and gifts. Having few, if any, ways to leave on their own. Step 5. The return flights. Return legs, while not always cleanly documented for every trip, generally mirror the inbound routes. Santa Fe to Teterboro, Santa Fe to West Palm Beach, or multi-stop itineraries linking Santa Fe to other Epstein properties. In at least one instance, Jane's 1997 trip, defense lawyers in the Maxwell case noted the absence of a clearly logged return flight from New Mexico for that specific journey. That gap is itself part of the record. It underscores that the logs are detailed but not perfect. Who enabled movement and access? Given this structure, who made it possible? Fact: pilots. They physically moved people in and out. They kept the logs that now serve as the skeleton of the story. Some, like Vysotsky, benefited materially from Epstein's patronage, receiving land and other favors. Fact: inner circle assistants. They coordinated schedules, booked travel, and communicated with guests. Their repeated presence alongside Epstein on Santa Fe flights suggests they knew the ranch, its rhythms, and its role. Fact: ranch managers and on-site staff. They handled housing, meals, and maintenance. They controlled physical access to the property and, by extension, to any state land beyond the gates. The state land office's experience being obstructed when trying to inspect trust land indicates that ranch management, not just Epstein himself, played a role in managing visibility. The unknowns: drivers, local contractors, and low-level staff. We don't have a public roster of drivers who handled airport to ranch and in-town runs. Local contractors, electricians, plumbers, and caterers who may have worked regular jobs inside the compound. Temporary staff hired for specific events. Many of these people would have seen who came and went, whether guests were obviously underage, whether law enforcement ever appeared at the gates. Their silence in the public record is a gap, not necessarily evidence of wrongdoing, but a missing layer of potential testimony. Records that should exist but haven't surfaced. As we zoom out, one question becomes central. Beyond the flight logs and land office leases, what other records should exist about Zorro Ranch's operations? Reasonable candidates include internal guest lists or calendars, security logs from the front gate and interior cameras, phone and email records coordinating trips, deliveries, and services, payroll and HR files for staff and contractors, invoices and receipts from vendors, including local businesses. The unknown. We do not know from the public record whether the FBI or New Mexico investigators ever secured these categories of records, whether they were destroyed, moved, or are sitting in sealed files, whether the new owners of the ranch inherited any of them with the property. What we can say is that in other Epstein properties, searches turned up hard drives, photographs, and documents that formed part of later cases. At Zorro Ranch, no such recovery has been publicly described. That brings us to the next part of our story, the political and institutional environment in which Zorro Ranch existed. Political and institutional shielding. When you see a pattern of inaction around a controversial figure, one natural question is, who was he connected to? In New Mexico, Epstein was not just a private landowner, he was also a political donor, and he benefited from a series of legal and bureaucratic decisions that, taken together, look a lot like protection, even if no one sat down and deliberately planned it that way. We'll walk through that carefully, separating documented donations and decisions, allegations about their impact, questions that remain unanswered. Epstein's donations to New Mexico officials. Fact. Public campaign finance records and subsequent reporting show that Epstein made significant contributions to New Mexico political figures in the early 2000s. Bill Richardson, then governor, received tens of thousands of dollars for his 2002 campaign and additional contributions for his 2006 re-election bid. Gary King, who would later serve as Attorney General, received donations for his 2006 AG race and for his 2014 gubernatorial campaign, some directly from Epstein, others from entities tied to his Virgin Islands base. Jim Baca, a former land commissioner, received funds for his campaigns. A Santa Fe County Sheriff, Jim Solano, was also a recipient. When the Epstein scandal reignited in 2019, some of these officials returned the donations or donated equivalent amounts to charities, but the money had already done its primary work, funding campaigns and building access. The unknown. We do not have internal emails or memos showing that any official changed a specific decision because of those donations. There's no smoking gun document that says do not investigate the ranch, he's a donor. However, the pattern, large donations to officials whose offices touch land, law enforcement, and oversight, forms part of the context. Bill Richardson, presence versus allegation. Bill Richardson appears in the record in two distinct ways. Fact. Present. He was a guest at Zorro Ranch at least once. This has been acknowledged in public reporting. Flight logs and contemporary accounts place him in Epstein's orbit in New Mexico, as they do with many other political and business figures. Allegation. Abuse. Virginia Giuffre has alleged in sworn civil filings that she was directed to have sex with Richardson, among others, as part of her trafficking. She has in some accounts linked those alleged encounters to Zorro Ranch. Richardson has categorically denied these allegations. He has said he never met Giuffre. He has said he never saw Epstein with underage girls. He has called the accusations completely false. Adjudication status. No criminal charges have been brought against Richardson in relation to Epstein in New Mexico or elsewhere. No court has adjudicated Giuffre's specific allegations about him. They remain contested allegations, supported by her sworn testimony and challenged by his categorical denial. For purposes of this episode, we can say, fact, Richardson visited the ranch and received donations from Epstein. The allegation is Giuffre says he abused her. He says he did not. The unknown is whether additional witnesses or records could corroborate or refute her claim. Gary King and the sex offender registry decision. We've already touched on this, but it's worth revisiting as part of institutional shielding. Fact, in 2010, under the watch of Attorney General Gary King, New Mexico's Department of Public Safety decided that Epstein did not have to remain on the state's sex offender registry. The key points. Epstein initially registered in New Mexico after his Florida conviction. Within days, DPS reversed course, citing illegal interpretation. Under the statute then in effect, registration for certain offenses was triggered only if the victim was under 16. Florida paperwork provided to New Mexico listed the victim was 17. Therefore, DPS concluded Epstein did not meet statutory threshold. The decision was strictly speaking a legal interpretation, a reading of the letter of state law as applied to the data in front of them. But Subsequent reporting showed that the victim in question was actually 16, that the age misstatement appears to have come from how Florida summarized the case, and that no one in New Mexico seems to have independently checked that critical detail. The allegation and interference. Critics have argued that New Mexico's decision was overly narrow, focusing on a technical point without weighing the broader risk. The existence of donations from Epstein to King create at least an appearance of conflict of interest, even if no direct link to the decision is documented. The unknown. We do not have internal DPS or Attorney General emails explaining the thought process behind the decision. We do not know if any staff member raised concerns or suggested a more conservative approach and was overruled. What we can say is that the result, a man known to be a convicted sex offender no longer being listed as such in New Mexico, lowered the likelihood that local law enforcement or neighbors would scrutinize activity at Zorro Ranch through a public safety lens. The overlapping jurisdictions, who led and who deferred. Institutional shielding doesn't always look like active cover-up. Sometimes it looks like deference. In the Epstein story, that deference shows up in how New Mexico handled its role once SDNY got involved. Fact. New Mexico opened a criminal investigation in early 2019. After Epstein's arrest in New York, state officials repeatedly emphasized they were coordinating with SDNY and did not want to jeopardize the federal case. New Mexico gathered facts and then stood back. The interference. This deference is understandable. Federal prosecutors had broader reach, more resources, and an active indictment, but it also meant that no one took ownership of Zorro Ranch as a crime scene in its own right. The unknown. Whether any New Mexico investigator or prosecutor recommended a state search warrant or charges and was dissuaded by higher-ups or by federal partners. Whether behind closed doors, federal authorities ever signaled that Zorro Ranch was off the table for logistical or strategic reasons. Without those internal communications, we're left with the outward pattern, a state that had enough concern to investigate, but not enough conviction or authority or political will to independently act on the ranch. The documented versus the interfered versus the unanswered. To stay disciplined, let's summarize. Documented. Epstein donated substantial sums to New Mexico officials whose portfolios touched law enforcement and land. New Mexico removed him from its sex offender registry in 2010 based on a narrow reading of state law and possibly flawed Florida paperwork. The Attorney General's office opened then closed a criminal probe into his New Mexico activities without charges. It deferred to SDNY. The State Land Office was obstructed in its attempts to inspect state land inside the ranch perimeter. Inferred, not proven, that donations gave Epstein softer treatment beyond what the law required. That New Mexico's deference to SDNY was excessive, leaving gaps that no one else filled. The unanswered. What internal dissent or discussion occurred around the registry decision and the choice not to seek a search warrant for Zorro Ranch? Whether any federal directive influenced state action. These unanswered questions are part of the reason New Mexico legislators are now talking about a truth commission. They're not just trying to retell what happened at the ranch. They're trying to understand how their own systems failed. Media coverage and silence. For most people, the Epstein story came into focus through media, not court dockets. But not all locations were treated equally. Palm Beach, the Manhattan Townhouse, and Little St. James became iconic. Zorro Ranch did not. In this part, we'll look at why. Where the spotlight fell and where it didn't. Fact. The Miami Herald's Perversion of Justice series, which reignited national attention on Epstein in 2018, centered on Florida, the victims, the prosecution agreement, and the failures of the U.S. Attorney's Office there. National coverage in 2019 focused on the raid of Epstein's Manhattan house, the raid of his private island in the Virgin Islands, high-profile names on flight logs. New Mexico and Zorro Ranch in particular tended to appear as a bullet point in lists of Epstein's properties. A mystery compound in a handful of national TV segments, the subject of local and regional reporting rather than sustained national investigative series. Local investigative work. Inside New Mexico, the picture looks different. Fact. Outlets like New Mexico In Depth, the Santa Fe Reporter, and the Santa Fe New Mexican devoted substantial coverage. 2. The state land offices document releases and lease cancellations. Hector Balderas' and Raul Torres' shifting approaches to the Epstein file. The attempted and eventual sale of Zorro Ranch. The proposed Truth Commission. Some of the most detailed public explanations of how the state handled Epstein come from these local pieces. They tracked the 400-plus pages sent to the Attorney General, the fact that many Attorney General files are still heavily redacted, the absence of a criminal case. At the national level, standout work on Zorro Ranch includes CBS News segments highlighting that Zorro Ranch was the only major U.S. Epstein property not raided by federal agents. On-camera interviews with Land Commissioner Stephanie Garcia Richard, who warned that there was a story to be told in New Mexico. Associated Press coverage linking the ranch to state's sex offender registry loophole, the proposed Truth Commission to broader questions about institutional failure. Still, compared to the Florida and New York coverage, the New Mexico story got a fraction of the airtime. Why Zorro Ranch got less attention? There are practical and editorial reasons for this. Practical reasons. No dramatic images. There was never a televised raid on Zorro Ranch. No helicopter shots of agents carrying boxes out of the mansion. In TV journalism, pictures drive coverage. No high-profile New Mexico trial. SDNY hosted the Maxwell trial. Florida had the NPA scandal. New Mexico had no comparable courtroom drama tied to Epstein. Physical remoteness. Sending crews to an isolated property in rural New Mexico is more expensive and logistically complex than sending them to Palm Beach or Manhattan. Editorial reasons. Narrative focus. National outlets frame the Epstein story around a failed federal prosecution in Florida, a new forceful federal prosecution in New York, a private island as emblem of extreme privilege and secrecy. Complexity of the New Mexico angle. The New Mexico story is heavier on land lease law, sex offender registry thresholds, jurisdictional coordination. It's harder to boil down into a single emotionally charged sentence. The result: the physical reality of Zorro Ranch, what it looked like, who went there, how it was used, never imprinted on the public imagination the way Epstein's Island did. That, in turn, may have reduced pressure on institutions to answer the unanswered questions around the ranch. Role of independent and citizen investigators. Outside of traditional media, patchwork of independent researchers, archivists, and citizen journalists have played a significant role in keeping the Zorro Ranch story alive, hosting scans of the pilot logs and building searchable databases, compiling and annotating state land and attorney general documents, mapping Epstein-related addresses and staff histories, including those tied to the ranch. These efforts are uneven in quality, but collectively, they've preserved documents that might otherwise be hard to find, pushed mainstream outlets and officials to pay more attention to New Mexico, helped bloggers, podcasters, and now this episode reconstruct Zorro Ranch from multiple angles. The flip side is that in the absence of a single authoritative account, speculation has flourished online. Rumors about underground bunkers, secret labs, or exotic projects at the ranch have circulated widely, without any solid evidence. That's part of why a disciplined, evidence-only reconstruction is necessary, to pull the story back to what we can actually substantiate. What was never done? An inventory of institutional inaction. We spent a lot of time on what happened. Now we need to look squarely at what did not happen. This will not be comfortable listening, but it's necessary if Zorro Ranch is to be understood as a case study in systematic failure. Searches never conducted. Fact. As far as the public records show, no federal law enforcement agency ever executed a search warrant at Zorro Ranch. There are no unsealed warrant affidavits, no recorded returns, no confirmed instances of FBI evidence collection at the ranch. Fact. New Mexico's Attorney General did not execute a state-level search warrant at the ranch, either before or after Epstein's death. The unknown. Whether any limited consensual walkthrough or surveillance was performed that never saw daylight. Whether any sealed warrant exists that has not yet surfaced, even in recent unsealing waves. But based on what's publicly known, if you imagine the standard crime scene treatment, tape, evidence bags, forensics teams, it never happened at Zorro Ranch. Warrants never served, as far as the records show. Fact. Compared to New York and the Virgin Islands, where search warrants were acknowledged and in some cases, the supporting papers partially unsealed, there is no matching paper trail for New Mexico. No judge's order authorizing entry and search of Zorro Ranch has been made public. In a world where survivors said they were abused there, flight logs show regular traffic in and out, state officials documented obstruction of land inspections. The absence of a publicly documented search warrant is striking. Records never or not yet released. Fact. The New Mexico Attorney General's investigative file on Epstein is heavily redacted in response to public records requests. Many pages are blacked out under exemptions for confidential sources and law enforcement methods. The public does not have full transcripts of victim interviews, complete internal memoranda analyzing legal options around Zorro Ranch, clear documentation of recommendations made and rejected. Fact. The 400-plus pages sent by the State Land Office to the Attorney General have only been selectively published. We've seen the leases, the cancellation notices, and some correspondence, but not every page. The unknown. Whether more detailed staff lists, emails, or inspection notes are sitting in those files. Whether any federal agencies shared New Mexico's specific intelligence back to the state, and, if so, how it was handled. Witnesses never publicly questioned. Fact. Key potential witnesses with first-hand knowledge of Zorro Ranch operations, including ranch managers like Karen and Bryce Gordon, and certain long-term staff, have not testified in any public forum. They have not been questioned in open legislative hearings or public commissions about guest lists, staff policies, how they responded to the land office's attempts to inspect state trust land. Fact. New Mexico's legislature has never held a full-blown public hearing focused solely on Epstein's activities in the state, with subpoenaed witness and sworn testimony. Unknown. Whether some of these witnesses have quietly spoken to investigators under confidentiality, whether they would cooperate if compelled by a future truth commission. Charges never brought. Fact. No New Mexico prosecutor has ever brought an indictment against Jeffrey Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell, any other alleged co-conspirator conduct committed at Zorro Ranch. Fact. Civil lawsuits have alleged New Mexico incidents, and those suits have sometimes referenced New Mexico law, but the state's own criminal justice system has never tested those allegations in court. In that sense, from the standpoint of New Mexico criminal law, Zorro Ranch remains legally untouched. Fact, allegation, and the unknown matrix. To close the loop and keep the record clean, we now put the pieces into a matrix, exactly as you asked. This is not exhaustive, but it captures the core claims we've made in this episode and how they're grounded. The verified facts. Epstein bought Zorro Ranch in 1993 and controlled it through entities such as Zorro Trust and Cypress Incorporated. The ranch comprised roughly 7,500 to 10,000 acres of private land, plus about 1,200 acres of state trust land leased for grazing, but functioning as a privacy buffer. The main house is approximately 26,700 square feet, with a private airstrip, hangar, helipad, firehouse, garages, and stables. New Mexico's State Land Office provided over 400 pages of Zorro-related documents to the Attorney General in 2019, and later canceled the Cypress leases for obstruction and misrepresentation. The New Mexico Attorney General's office opened a criminal investigation into Epstein's activities at Zorro Ranch, interviewed at least 2 survivors, and closed the case without filing charges. No publicly acknowledged federal or state search warrant has ever been executed at Zorro Ranch. Ghislaine Maxwell was convicted in 2021 on federal sex trafficking-related charges. Annie Farmer's testimony about being groomed and touched at Zorro Ranch was part of the evidence at her trial. Epstein made significant political donations to New Mexico officials, including Bill Richardson, Gary King, and others. In 2010, New Mexico's Department of Public Safety determined that Epstein did not have to remain on the state's sex offender registry, based on the interpretation that the Florida victim was 17 and state law required a victim under 16 for registration in that category. Court-documented claims. Virginia Giuffre's civil filings and depositions state that she was trafficked by Epstein and Maxwell to multiple properties, including Zorro Ranch, and that she was directed to have sex with certain powerful men there. Annie Farmer's civil complaint and Maxwell trial testimony described sexual grooming and contact at Zorro Ranch when she was 16, including Epstein getting into bed with her and Maxwell giving her a topless massage. Priscilla Doe and other Jane Doe plaintiffs allege in sworn complaints that Epstein coerced them into sex acts at Zorro Ranch between the late 1990s and late 2000s. Jane Doe 10's statement Read in court describes crashing an ATV at Epstein's ranch and being told, "No one gets in trouble for anything here." These are all on the record as claims made under oath or in court documents. They have not all been resolved by trial verdicts in New Mexico. Survival testimony. Virginia Giuffre says she was trafficked to Zorro Ranch as part of being used as a sex slave between 2000 and 2002, and has produced photos of herself in New Mexico as a teenager. Maria Farmer states that in 1996, Epstein and Maxwell assaulted her in Ohio, and that Epstein flew her 15-year-old sister Annie to Zorro Ranch, where both assaulted Annie on a massage table. Annie Farmer recounts being flown to Zorro Ranch at 16, being subjected to Epstein's and Maxwell's sexualized behavior there, and later testified to that effect in Maxwell's criminal trial. Shantae Davies describes being groomed by Epstein, working as a massage therapist and flight attendant, traveling on his jets, including high-profile trips. Secondary accounts link her to Zorro Ranch, among other properties. Anonymous Jane Does describe ranch episodes, including the ATV crash and more general abuse narratives, at a ranch in New Mexico. Those accounts are consistent across multiple tellings, and in several cases are backed by third-party witnesses and documentation. The allegations. Giuffre's claims that she was directed to have sex with specific men at Zorro Ranch, including Bill Richardson, Prince Andrew, Alan Dershowitz, and others, are allegations. Each of those men has issued strong public denials, and none has been criminally charged in New Mexico for that conduct. Assertions that ranch managers Karen and Bryce Gordon hosted sex parties or recruited local showgirls are based on secondary reporting and not sworn testimony. Commentaries that attribute New Mexico's failure to charge Epstein or search Zorro Ranch directly to corruption or a deliberate cover-up tied to campaign donations are interpretive claims, not findings of any court or commission. The unknowns. Whether any sealed or limited search of Zorro Ranch was conducted that has not been revealed in public records. Whether federal authorities actively chose not to search the ranch, and if so, what their rationale was. What internal debates occurred within the New Mexico's Attorney General's office around seeking a search warrant or bringing state charges? Whether ranch managers and staff observed or enabled abuse, and if so, what they would say under oath? How many times each specific survivor went to Zorro Ranch, and on exactly which flights, beyond what is visible in the current released logs? What additional documentation, guest lists, security logs, digital media may have existed at the ranch, and where is it now? The conclusion. We end where we begin, in the high desert in New Mexico, on a mesa outside Santa Fe, at a property that was real, occupied, and according to multiple women, a place of harm. Why Zorro Ranch still matters. Zorro Ranch matters because it sits at the intersection of private power, Epstein's money, aircraft, and networks, public systems, state and lands, sex offender registries, and law enforcement jurisdictions, survivor narratives, detailed consistent accounts of grooming and abuse, institutional failure, the absence to this day of a thorough public, evidence-driven investigation into what happened there. It's not just another property on Epstein's list, it's the outlier. Remote, purpose-built, connected by private jets, and never rated. In that sense, Zorro Ranch is a test of whether we can confront the full geography of abuse, or whether we stop at what's easiest to see. Why time does not erase accountability. Jeffrey Epstein is dead. Ghislaine Maxwell is in prison. Many of the survivors have received some compensation through civil settlements. But accountability is not just about individual punishment. It's also about what institutions did or didn't do, what records were kept or destroyed, what lessons are learned or ignored. Time has passed. The ranch has a new name and new owners, but the decisions New Mexico made, or failed to make, about Zorro Ranch are not resolved by the sale of real estate. If anything, the passage of time makes it more important to capture survivor testimony while memories and witnesses are still available. Secure and release documents before they are lost. Examine, with some distance, the structural forces, political donations, statutory gaps, and jurisdictional habits that allowed a known sex offender to maintain a compound in plain sight. Why public records still hold answers. For all we do not know, there is an enormous amount of paper and data already in existence. Lease files and correspondence in the State Land Office archives, investigative memos and interviews transcripts in the Attorney General's files, flight logs and manifests in federal court records, financial transactions and suspicious activity reports in banking files, internal communications within law enforcement agencies, still sealed or redacted. Many of these can, in principle, be declassified or released to a properly empowered commission. They don't require speculation, they require political will. A serious inquiry, even now, could build a definitive timeline of who visited Zorro Ranch and when, map staff and management roles and responsibilities, reconstruct the decisions not to search, not to charge, and not to keep Epstein on the registry list, produce a public report that survivors, citizens, and future lawmakers can use as a reference, rather than leaving the story fractured across lawsuits and press clips. A call for transparency, not speculation. In telling this story, we've stayed within the lines of what can be sourced and labeled. Facts from deeds, leases, logs, and official statements, court-documented claims from indictments, complaints, and trial transcripts, survivor testimony in their own words, under oath, or in attributable interviews, allegations clearly marked as such, where the law has not reached a conclusion, unknowns acknowledged as places where the record runs out. That discipline matters. Zorro Ranch has attracted its share of conspiracy theories and lurid speculation. The danger is that in chasing the sensational, we lose the sight of the very real, very grounded failures already in the record. A sex offender taken off the registry on a technicality, a state land use system that became a privacy shield, a pattern of deference to federal authorities that left a major property unsearched, survivors who continue to carry the memory of what happened in a house on a hill in New Mexico. There isn't a single answer to who enabled Epstein. He was enabled by a network of people and institutions that did different things at different times. Some actively facilitated abuse, some protected him legally, some looked the other way. Some benefited from his money or connections and didn't ask questions. These are people who, based on criminal convictions or civil cases, were most closely involved in Epstein's abuse operation. 1. Direct co-conspirators and facilitators. These are people who, based on criminal convictions or civil cases, were most closely involved in Epstein's abuse operation. Ghislaine Maxwell, status, convicted federal sex trafficker in 2021. Her role, recruited, groomed, and normalized contact with minors and young women, scheduled massages that were in practice sexual encounters, participated in some abuse herself, according to multiple survivors, including Annie Farmer and others, enabling actions, provided Epstein with social cover, the British socialite fixer, manage properties, household rules, and staff, help ensure a constant supply of victims, and train new recruits in the system. Legally and evidentially, Maxwell is the clearest, most proven enabler. The inner circle assistants, Kellen, Marcinkova, Taylor, and others. Names often cited: Sarah Kellen, Nadia Marcinkova, Emmy Taylor, and other assistants and schedulers who appeared frequently in flight logs. What's alleged in civil suits and affidavits: they booked young women and girls for massages. They called and texted victims to arrange travel and appointments. They sometimes opened the door, led victims upstairs, prepared rooms, laid out oils and towels. In some accounts, they also participated in or facilitated abuse. Legal status: none of these women have been criminally convicted in connection with Epstein's crimes. They have been named as co-conspirators or subjects in civil cases and investigative reporting, and some received immunity or effective non-prosecution in Florida's 2007 NPA. They enabled Epstein by operating the machinery, calendars, phones, travel, and on-the-ground logistics that made systematic abuse possible. Pilots, house managers, and staff. The pilots flew Epstein and his guests between properties, logged the names and numbers of passengers, saw a steady rotation of young women and girls, often traveling alone with Epstein. Most claim they never saw explicit sexual acts. House managers and butlers followed strict household manuals about how to treat Epstein and guests. Booked massage therapists, stocked the house with items Epstein requested, kept money in bathrooms for paying the girls. In some cases, admitted they understood the massages were sexual. Other staff maintained the environments where the abuse occurred. They often claim they had no clear knowledge of crimes, but were close enough to see unusual patterns: constant young female visitors, late-night massages, and secrecy. Whether each specific staffer enabled Epstein depends on what they knew and what they did. But collectively, this network provided the operational continuity that allowed him to run the same pattern for decades. Lawyers, fixers, and dealmakers. Epstein's ability to avoid serious consequences in 2007 and 8 was not an accident, it was engineered. Defense team in Florida. Notable names: high-profile defense attorneys and fixers including Alan Dershowitz and others, who helped negotiate his Florida non-prosecution agreement. What they did This is documented. They pressured federal prosecutors, crafted a deal that gave Epstein limited state charges, minimal jail time, and immunity for unnamed co-conspirators, ensured that the NPA was initially kept secret from victims, later found by a federal judge to violate the Crime Victims' Rights Act, though that ruling was reversed on jurisdictional grounds. Legally, defense lawyers are allowed, even obliged, to seek the best possible deal for their client, but in practical terms, their success enabled Epstein to serve a light sentence, avoid federal conviction, resume a version of his life, still wealthy and highly mobile, with Zorro Ranch and other properties intact. Alexander Acosta in the U.S. Attorney's Office. Status: then, U.S. Attorney who approved the 2007 NPA, later U.S. Secretary of Labor who resigned in 2019 under pressure over the case. What's documented? Acosta's office negotiated the NPA that immunized Epstein and co-conspirators from federal prosecution in that district. The deal was not fully disclosed to victims, violating their statutory rights. An internal DOJ review later criticized aspects of the agreement and victim notification, even though it did not formally punish the prosecutors. By agreeing to the NPA, Acosta's office took federal charges off the table in Florida, sent a message that Epstein's crimes were a matter of state-level prosecution, not organized trafficking, helped preserve Epstein's social acceptability among people willing to overlook or rationalize a solicitation conviction, especially if they trusted his PR spin. That decision is one of the clearest examples of institutional enabling in his story. Institutions that failed or looked away. Beyond individuals, entire institutions created an environment where Epstein can operate. Federal law enforcement and prosecutors pre-2018. The FBI and DOJ had multiple opportunities. In Florida in the mid-2000s and later when victims came forward in other jurisdictions to build a comprehensive trafficking case sooner. In Florida, instead of indicting Epstein on strong federal sex trafficking charges, they negotiated an NPA. Later defended that agreement, even as victims challenged it. Even if some agents did push for more aggressive action, the institutional result was clear. Epstein kept his fortune, his network, and his properties. State and local law enforcement, especially in New Mexico and New York. New Mexico took Epstein off its sex offender registry on a narrow reading of the law, opened but did not follow through on a criminal investigation, deferring it to SDNY. Never searched Zorro Ranch despite multiple survivor accounts and the ranch's obvious isolation. New York authorities pre-2019. Over the years, various agencies had glimpses of Epstein's behavior, from civil suits, media reporting, or victim complaints. None moved decisively before 2019 to treat him as a serial trafficker. These agencies may not have actively protected him, but their inaction enabled his operations to continue. The financial institutions. Later investigations, including civil suits by the Virgin Islands and other entities, have drawn out how banks and wealth management structures failed. Some banks continued to serve Epstein as a client after his 2008 conviction. Internal compliance systems flagged unusual payments and patterns, large repetitive transfers to young women, payments described as consulting to people with no obvious qualifications. But these red flags did not lead to decisive action in time. These failures resulted in settlements where banks paid hundreds of millions and admitted they should have done more to identify and report suspicious activity. By keeping his accounts open and his transactions flowing, financial institutions made it possible for Epstein to pay victims and recruiters, maintain properties like Zorro Ranch, move funds across jurisdictions without serious interruption. The elite institutions, universities, foundations, and cultural organizations. Epstein built an aura of respectability in part by being associated with universities and labs, donations to research centers, hosting scientists at his properties, funding pseudo-philanthropic projects, arts and cultural spaces, museum boards, high-end social functions, charitable foundations, some of which he funded or used for image laundering. In many cases, these institutions accepted his money and his presence, even after 2008, sometimes framing him as a rehabilitated donor. They may have quietly cut ties later, but few issued forceful public statements at the time that would have warned others. By lending him prestige and providing network forums, they helped him rebuild legitimacy after his Florida conviction, which in turn made guests more willing to accept his invitations, made staff more willing to work for him, helped normalize his continued influence. Social and cultural collaborators. Some people enabled Epstein less by what they did in courtrooms or boardrooms, and more by normalizing his presence. Friends, guests, and social circles. Flight logs and social photographs documented a long list of prominent people who flew on his jets, visited his properties, including Zorro Ranch in some cases, attended dinners or events he hosted. Most of them have not been accused in crimes. For many, the evidence suggests that they enjoyed his hospitality, benefited from introductions and access, accepted or didn't notice the presence of much younger women. Their enabling, then, is cultural and reputational. By continuing to be seen with him even after 2008, they helped signal that he was still part of the club. That, in turn, gave cover to institutions and staff who might have otherwise questioned why they were working for him. Media blind spots and soft treatment. For years, mainstream media reported on his wealth and connections with a light touch, treated early allegations as gossip or minor scandal rather than signs of a serial predator. It took dogged work by a small number of journalists like Julie K. Brown in Florida. Lawsuits and FOIA Batalesto bring the full scale of his behavior back into focus around 2018 and 19. Before that, the relative absence of hard-hitting coverage enabled Epstein by keeping public pressure off prosecutors and police, allowing him to continue fundraising and networking. The difference between legal guilt and real-world enabling. It's important to separate two levels. 1. Legal responsibility. Who committed crimes, who conspired, who violated duties under specific statutes. 2. Moral structure and enabling. Who created or tolerated the conditions that allowed those crimes to continue? On level 1, we know Epstein himself was the central perpetrator. Ghislaine Maxwell was found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of conspiracy, enticement, and trafficking-related crimes, based on evidence including grooming at properties like Zorro Ranch. On level 2, there's a longer list. Inner circle assistants and staff who handled victims as appointments. Lawyers and prosecutors who negotiated and signed off on the 2007-2008 NPA. Banks that kept him as a client despite obvious red flags. State agencies that narrowly interpreted registry laws and then never revisited their decisions. Universities and cultural institutions that accepted his money and introductions after his convictions. Friends and guests who continued to treat him as a normal, desirable social contact. Not all of these people and entities are criminals. Many would say they were misled or kept in the dark. Some likely were. But collectively, they enabled Epstein in a real-world sense. They made it clear for him to keep doing what he did, for longer, in more places, with more victims. What we still don't know. There are still key questions about enabling that only internal records and sworn testimony can answer. For example, did any staff member at Zorro Ranch in New York or in Florida try to report abuse and get shut down? Were there internal dissenters in law enforcement or at banks who raised alarms that were overruled? To what extent did political donations or personal relationships actually influence decisions like the New Mexico registry ruling or the choice not to search Zorro Ranch? Those answers would require subpoena power, full access to internal memos, emails, and compliance reports, witnesses willing or compelled to testify under oath. The short version, if you boil it down, who enabled Epstein? Core co-conspirators like Ghislaine Maxwell and Inner Circle assistants, who recruited, scheduled, and groomed victims. Staff and pilots who kept his operation physically running, even if some now claim not to have understood the full extent. Lawyers and prosecutors who gave him an extraordinary favorable deal in Florida and kept victims in the dark. State and federal agencies that failed to search key properties, failed to coordinate, or interpreted laws in ways that minimized his official risk. Financial institutions that kept his accounts open and treated his activity as business as usual. Elite institutions and social networks that lent him legitimacy and company after he was already a convicted sex offender. The reason this matters now is not to retroactively damn every person who ever crossed paths with him, but to map the failure points. Where gatekeepers, legal, financial, institutional, could have stopped or limited him, but didn't. So that, in future cases, our systems don't once again let a man like this build a network like this and call it normal. Here's a structured rundown of Ghislaine Maxwell's conviction, what she was charged with, what the jury actually found, what conduct the government proved, how she was sentenced, and what happened on appeal, as of December 17th, 2025. Number 1, case overview and timeline. The case, United States v. Ghislaine Maxwell, 20 CR 330, SDNY, justice.gov. Jurisdiction: U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York, which is federal. Judge at trial and sentencing: U.S. District Judge Allison J. Nathan, later elevated to the Second Circuit. The arrest: July 2020 in New Hampshire. The trial began November 29, 2021, lasted about a month. The verdict: December 29, 2021, guilty on 5 of 6 counts. The sentencing: June 28, 2022, 20 years, 240 months of a prison sentence. 2. The charges and what the jury decided. Maxwell was tried on 6 felony counts from the second superseding indictment. 2 perjury counts were served for a separate trial. Conspiracy-type counts. These allege she joined with Jeffrey Epstein to commit specific sex crime offenses involving minors. Count 1, conspiracy to entice minors to travel to engage in illegal sex acts. The statutes: 18 U.S.C. 371 and 18 U.S.C. 2422. The verdict: guilty, later merged by the judge with other conspiracies as multiplicitous for judgment purposes. Count 3, conspiracy to transport minors with intent to engage in criminal sexual activity. Statutes 18 U.S.C. 371 and 2423. The verdict: guilty. Count 5, sex trafficking conspiracy. Statutes 18 U.S.C. 371 and 1591. Verdict: guilty. Judge Nathan later held that 3 conspiracy counts were multiplicitous, essentially overlapping, so she entered judgment on only 1 conspiracy count when she issued the final judgment. Substantive sex crime counts. These covered specific acts beyond the general conspiracies. Count 2, enticement of a minor to travel to engage in illegal sex acts. Statutes 18 U.S.C. 2422 and 2, aiding and abetting. The verdict: non-guilty. Count 4, transportation of a minor with intent to engage in criminal sexual activity. Statutes 18 U.S.C. 2423 and 2. Verdict: guilty. Count 6, sex trafficking of a minor. Statutes 18 U.S.C. 1591 and 2. Verdict: guilty. Maximum exposure. In total, the counts carried a theoretical maximum of up to 65 years in prison, 40 years on sex trafficking of a minor, 10 on transportation, 15 across the conspiracy counts. What conduct the prosecution proved. The government's core theory, accepted by the jury, was that from 1994 to 2004, Maxwell recruited and groomed girls, some as young as 14 for Epstein, normalized sexual contact, often under the guise of massages, arranged travel for them to Epstein's home in New York and Florida, and to other properties. The 4 main victims at trial. The superseding indictment focused on 4 minor victims, all girls at the time of the events. 3 testified under pseudonyms, 1 used her real name. Jane met Epstein at 14, testified she was sexually abused by Epstein with Maxwell's participation and encouragement at Palm Beach, New York, and New Mexico, including being flown to Epstein's properties. Kate met Maxwell in London at 17, described being invited to Epstein's townhouse, being told to give him a massage, and being pushed into repeated sexual contact. Her account focused primarily on the UK and New York, but illustrated the grooming method. Carolyn met Epstein around 14 in Palm Beach, testifying she was paid for massages that were sex acts, and that she was encouraged to recruit other girls. Her evidence anchored the Florida part of the scheme. Annie Farmer, the only accuser to testify under her full name, met Epstein via her sister Maria. She was 16 when she testified. Maxwell and Epstein brought her to New York, then flew her to Epstein's ranch in New Mexico, where Epstein got into bed with her and pressed himself against her, and Maxwell gave her a topless massage. The New Mexico episode Zorro Ranch was treated as part of the grooming pattern, even though New Mexico's age of consent law meant those specific contacts were not charged as standalone New Mexico crimes. Other key evidence: the government corroborated these accounts with flight logs showing Maxwell repeatedly traveling with Epstein and young women between Teterboro, Palm Beach, Santa Fe, St. Thomas. Staff testimony with pilots and employees describing Maxwell as Epstein's number 2, the steady presence of young girls, household rules emphasizing secrecy, financial records showing Epstein transferred roughly $23 million to Maxwell over the course of the conspiracy, and bought her a New York townhouse. Household manuals and notes instructing staff to see nothing, hear nothing, say nothing, unless asked, reinforcing the idea that Maxwell helped create a culture of silence. Judge Nathan later summarized the trial evidence as proving that Maxwell, directly, repeatedly, and over the course of many years, participated in a horrific scheme to entice, transport, and traffic underage girls for sexual abuse by and with Jeffrey Epstein. The sentencing, what she got and why. On June 28th, 2022, Judge Nathan imposed the following sentence. Imprisonment, 240 months on the sex trafficking of a minor count, 120 months on the transportation count, 60 months on the remaining conspiracy count, all to run concurrently for an effective sentence of 20 years. Supervised release, 5 years of supervised release after prison, with the shorter supervised release terms on other counts running concurrently. Financial penalties, a $750,000 fine, 3 counts at $250,000 each, $300 in special assessment, $100 per conviction account. The sentence was above the advisory guidelines range, which the court had calculated 188 to 235 months, but below the 30 to 55 years prosecutors requested. Judge Nathan's reasoning. In explaining the sentence, Judge Nathan emphasized the duration of the scheme, roughly a decade, the number of victims in their young ages, some as young as 14, Maxwell's central enabling role, not as a passive bystander, but as a recruiter, groomer, organizer of travel and logistics, her lack of genuine remorse. She acknowledged in carefully limited terms that she had been convicted with helping Jeffrey Epstein with his crimes, but did not accept full responsibility for what the jury had found. The judge said the 240-month term was needed to reflect the seriousness of the offenses, the need for just punishment and deterrence, the lasting harm to the victims. The way forward is not more rumor, it's more records, more testimony, more public scrutiny of the institutions that for decades treated Zorro Ranch as just another rich man's playground. Until that happens, this episode, and others like it, will have to serve as a provisional record, a map of what we know, a catalog of what went undone, and an invitation to those with power in New Mexico and Washington to finish the work that should have started years ago. You've been listening to the documentary-style reconstruction of Jeffrey Epstein and Zorro Ranch. The story is not over. The paper trail still exists. The question is whether anyone with authority will follow it all the way to the end. Thank you for listening to The Broken Truth. Leave your comments below. Share this episode with someone who's unfamiliar with Zorro Ranch. Leave us a 5-star review on Spotify. And until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and stay free.
In a world built on hidden histories and half-truths, we've only just begun to peel back the layers. Because what you've heard tonight was never meant to be known. But you were meant to find it. If you're ready to go deeper, leave us a review, comment your thoughts, share this episode, and step inside the archives. Join the inner circle, where the real evidence is kept. This is The Broken Truth, because the truth isn't whole, it's broken.